In 1896, a sailor was sleeping. He was suddenly awakened for war, and by the time he finished getting ready, the war was already over. Yes, in 1896 there was a war so absurd it sounds like a joke. It lasted exactly 38 minutes. 38 minutes. Less time than many people take to watch half of a YouTube video. And the most curious part, this wasn't an improvised fight between two small groups. It was an official war. On one side was the British Empire, at the time the largest empire in history. A country that controlled about a quarter of all the land on the planet. On the other side was Zanzibar, a small island off the coast of East Africa. Now imagine the scene. Early morning, in the island's harbor, 5 British warships appear, large, heavy, full of cannons aimed at the city. In the center of the capital, there is a palace made of wood and stone. Inside it is Khalid bin Bargash. He has just declared himself the new sultan of the island without asking permission from the British. And that, for the British Empire, was a problem, so they did something very direct. They sent an ultimatum, basically a message saying, you have 1 hour to leave the palace. If he obeyed, nothing would happen. If he refused, well, the answer was anchored in the harbor, 5 warships and dozens of cannons. Khalid received the message, thought for a moment, looked at the palace full of supporters, and gave an answer that would turn this small conflict into the shortest war in history. But to understand how a war can end in just 38 minutes, we need to look at the map. Right on the coast of East Africa, near the territory that is now Tanzania, there was an island called Zanzibar. At first glance, it looks like just another tropical island, but in the 19th century, Zanzibar was something much more important. It functioned as a major commercial hub in the Indian Ocean. Ships coming from Africa, India, the Middle East, and even Southeast Asia stopped there to trade goods. It was basically a huge meeting point for trade routes. And where there is trade, there is money. A lot of money. This naturally caught the attention of European powers, which at that time were competing for territories around the world. Among them was the British Empire. During that period, Great Britain was at the height of its power. Its ships controlled trade routes in practically every ocean, and Zanzibar was a very interesting piece on this board. Controlling that island meant strengthening British presence in East African trade. But there was another important detail, a detail that made the situation quite complicated. Zanzibar was also an active center of the slave trade. For centuries, thousands of people captured in the interior of Africa were taken to the island and sold to other regions of the world. Now here comes an interesting shift in British policy. In the early 19th century, Great Britain decided to abolish slavery in its empire. After a lot of pressure from abolitionist movements, the British government began to treat slavery as illegal. And more than that, they started patrolling the ocean, trying to intercept ships involved in this trade. In other words, the British wanted to maintain influence over Zanzibar, but at the same time wanted to end one of the island's most profitable activities. As you can imagine, this created constant tension, because local traders were not very interested in losing their main business. And there was another important factor. Even with all the British presence in the region, Zanzibar still had its own ruler, the Sultan. Officially, he was the leader of the island, but in practice, behind the throne, there was a growing influence from the British Empire, and the British had a very clear preference. They wanted a sultan who cooperated with their interests, someone who accepted their decisions, someone who helped reduce the slave trade, basically a ruler who did not cause problems. And one day, quite conveniently, the Sultan of Zanzibar suddenly died, and that was when the real problem began. The death of the Sultan of Zanzibar happened in a, let's say, sudden way. Officially, he died of natural causes, but many suspected something a bit less natural. Some believed he had been poisoned. And the main suspect was none other than his own cousin, a man named Khalid bin Bargash. Now imagine the situation. The ruler of the island dies suddenly, the throne becomes vacant, and immediately a dispute arises over who will take power. At that moment, there were basically 2 options. The first was Hamud bin Mohammed. He was seen by the British as the ideal candidate, more diplomatic, more willing to cooperate, and especially more open to British policies against the slave trade. The second option was Khalid bin Bargash, and Khalid had a completely different view. He did not like British influence, he did not like the idea of losing power, and he certainly did not like the idea of ending the slave trade, which was still extremely profitable for many local groups. Now here is a curious fact. This was not the first time Khalid had tried to take the throne. A few years earlier, when another sultan had died, Khalid had already tried to declare himself ruler. But the British intervened quickly, so when the Sultan died again, he decided to act much faster this time. Even before any negotiations began, Khalid marched straight to the royal palace of Zanzibar, and he did something that made his intention very clear. He declared himself the new sultan of the island. But what he did next made the situation even more tense. Khalid did not enter the palace alone. He brought thousands of supporters with him, about 3,000 armed men and women. And then they did something that completely changed the political atmosphere of the island. They barricaded the palace, doors closed, improvised defenses, soldiers positioned at the windows. Basically a very clear message to anyone who tried to remove him. Khalid was not just declaring that he was the new sultan, he was saying, "I am not leaving." And as you can imagine, this was not exactly the kind of behavior the British Empire liked to see. They tried to resolve the situation diplomatically. They sent messages, tried to negotiate, tried to convince Khalid to leave the palace peacefully, but Khalid completely ignored the British requests. When it became clear that Khalid had no intention of leaving the palace, the British realized the situation was reaching a limit. So the British decided to involve someone who had plenty of experience dealing with this kind of problem, Admiral Harry Rawson. Rawson was the commander of the British fleet responsible for the waters of East Africa. In other words, if any situation in the region began to get out of control, he was the person called to handle it, and that is exactly what happened. A message was sent to him explaining the situation. There is a man in the palace of Zanzibar declaring himself sultan against our will, and he does not want to leave. Rawson responded very simply. He said he would arrive the next morning. And he asked for only one thing, that all British citizens on the island be evacuated immediately, which as you can imagine is not exactly the kind of preparation made for a calm conversation. The next morning, 5 British warships began positioning themselves around the city in Zanzibar's harbor. Among them were 3 gunboats called Raccoon, Thrush, Sparrow, in addition to 2 larger ships including the cruiser St. George, where Admiral Rawson himself was. 5 ships armed to the teeth. Cannons pointed at the coast, and all of them looking directly at the palace where Khalid was. Shortly after the fleet arrived, an ultimatum was sent. Khalid had to abandon the palace before 9 a.m. If he was still there when the clock struck 9, the British cannons would open fire. Khalid's response was short and incredibly confident. He said, "We have no intention of leaving, and we do not believe you will actually open fire." Perhaps Khalid believed the British were bluffing. Perhaps he thought no one would start a war over a palace. But what happened next would turn this confrontation into something completely extraordinary. At 9 a.m., the British ultimatum officially expired. Inside the palace, Khalid and his supporters remained in position. Around 3,000 people were inside. Some had old rifles, others only improvised weapons. Outside, the situation was very different. 5 British warships were lined up in the harbor, each equipped with cannons far more powerful than anything Zanzibar possessed. The clock kept moving, 9:01, no sign of surrender, 9:02, and then the British cannons fired all at once. The first target was a small coastal battery of Zanzibar that tried to protect the palace. It was destroyed almost immediately. Meanwhile, the British ships began firing explosive shells directly at the palace. The walls began to break apart. The improvised barricades could not withstand the impact. Within minutes, parts of the building began to catch fire. The situation inside the palace turned into chaos, smoke, explosions, wood breaking, and hundreds of Khalid supporters trapped inside the burning building. Even so, the defenders still tried to respond. Zanzibar had a single warship in the harbor, a much older vessel far less equipped than the British ships. Even so, it tried to attack. The ship advanced and began firing at the British cruiser St. George, where Admiral Rawson was. But the shots caused virtually no damage. The British response came quickly. A few direct hits struck the Zanzibar ship, and within minutes, it began to sink. And with that, the island's naval defense practically disappeared. Even so, some small steamboats tried to approach the British ships, armed only with rifles. Yes, rifles, against ships full of cannons. As you can imagine, that did not end well. The boats were quickly neutralized. Now only the palace remained. For about half an hour, the British ships continued firing. More than 500 explosive shells hit the building. The palace was on fire. The roof began to collapse. And finally, someone climbed to the top of the building and lowered the Sultan's flag. That was the signal of surrender. And so, at 9:40 a.m., the war ended. The Anglo-Zanzibar War had lasted only 38 minutes, the shortest war in history. But despite its absurd duration, the consequences were far less brief. because when the smoke began to clear, the situation on the island was far from resolved. While the palace was being bombarded, while fire and smoke took over the building, while hundreds of people were still trying to protect themselves, Khalid made a decision. He fled. About 5 minutes after the bombardment began, Khalid left the palace through the back. He simply ran away, accompanied by a few close allies, and left behind thousands of supporters who were still inside the palace being hit by British cannons. Khalid ran through the city and sought refuge in a very specific place: the German embassy. Now this is important. At that time, Germany also had colonial interests in Africa, and maintaining good relations with certain local figures could be useful. So when he arrived there, Khalid was given protection. The British knew exactly where he was, but there was a problem. Invading a foreign embassy could cause a much bigger conflict, possibly even a war with another European power, and that was definitely not part of the plan. So Khalid stayed there, protected, while the rest of the situation in Zanzibar was resolved. About 20 minutes after the bombardment ended, Zanzibar already had a new ruler. Hamud bin Mohammed was officially placed on the throne, exactly the candidate the British had wanted from the beginning. And as expected, he began following British policies almost immediately. One of the main changes was direct, the definitive end of slavery in Zanzibar, something the British had been trying to impose for years. In other words, despite lasting only 38 minutes, the war had real and profound consequences. But Khalid's story was not over yet, because fleeing the palace was only the beginning. What happened to him afterward is almost as strange as the war itself. Khalid remained hidden in the German embassy, and for a while he managed to completely escape the consequences. With German help, he was taken to territories controlled by Germany in Africa, and there, he continued living a relatively comfortable life, without major problems, without immediate punishment, which, considering everything that happened, is at least curious. But this calm did not last forever. Years later, during World War I, the situation changed completely. European powers began to dispute African territories much more intensely, and eventually the British captured Khalid. In the end, Khalid spent the rest of his life far from power, far from the palace he tried to conquer. And this is the most ironic part of the whole story. He started a political crisis to become sultan, provoked a war against the greatest empire in the world, fled in the first minutes of the conflict, and ended up spending the rest of his life in exile. All of this for a war that lasted less than an hour, and perhaps that is the most curious point of all. The war was extremely short, but the decisions that led to it were long, complex, and in many moments, completely absurd. Because in the end, this story leaves a very simple question: how did such a sequence of bad decisions happen so quickly?